Good morning, everyone. So it gives me an immense pleasure to welcome you all to this lecture series. Today is the second lecture in the series. Professor Shobha Satyanath, formerly professor and head of the Department of Linguistics at University of Delhi, is our speaker. Professor has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. She fulfilled many positions. She was a reader in the Department of Linguistics at Assam University, the project director of an ICSSR-supported research project, Director, Center for Advanced Studies in Linguistics, University of Delhi. Director, BRICS and 7+1, the Indian Studies Program, Hansuk University of Foreign Studies, South Korea, etc. She is a prominent sociolinguist in India, interested in the related multidisciplinary areas of language variation and change, sociophonetics, dialectography, language contact, pidgins and creoles, multilingualism and language policy, socio-historical and quantitative linguistics, which translate into both her teaching and research. Professor Shobha majorly concentrated in eastern and northeastern India and on urban towns and cities across the country. She contributed many research works to linguistic field. We are fortunate to have her with us today. Professor will lecture on the topic Sociolinguistics Western Perspectives. On behalf of ISTL, I cordially welcome you, ma'am, to the lecture. And also, I welcome all the online and offline participants to this lecture series.
Thank you so much for this. Shall I begin?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for your kind introduction. So we go into the second series, and I think, as you all know, they have created multiple links. There's an echo here. Why is there an echo? Yeah, so they have created multiple links today and given timing. So I hope there should be no glitches today. And I must say that they arranged Zoom meetings entirely at my own request because I wanted to show some graphics and I thought Google may not allow me to use a presentation mode. That's why. So without losing time, I'm trying to share my screen now. Please enable screen sharing. Can you enable screen sharing, please? Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, but make me only a co-host, not the primary host. I'm still not able to share. Please enable. Could you please enable screen sharing?
Yes, ma'am, we are trying.
Okay.
Will she send any document to you?
Dear one, if this is an unpaid version, you don't have other option. The only thing you can make her as host.
Okay, do that, but keep an eye on the people who join late. That's all.
Yes, ma'am, we did it. We just this one.
Yeah. Okay, so I can do that now. Right. All right. Right, so you can see my screen now fully? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so, and I think one more instruction, we are supposed to log out at 11 and log in again. Am I right? Yeah, 11. So there are like, 20 minutes, right? Okay. All right. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming again. Last week, I shared various fundamental assumptions of social linguistics and its philosophy. Today, I provide you an overview of some of the key findings that shape the field. The related ideas have a long presence, long precedence in the past discourses of the 19th and the 20th centuries on language. However, the present social linguistics, as we know, is essentially a Western discipline built on the Western experiences. The classic paper by Weinrich, Lebov, and Herzog, 1968, laid the empirical foundations for the study of language change. The study of language in social contexts, which grew into a theory of variation and change, is entirely to William Lebov's credit. Some more people here admit. What do I do? Just a minute. No, how do I get out of this? Okay. Right. So the study of language in something is happening. Why is it not moving? Right. So the study of language in social contexts, which grew into a theory of variation and change, is entirely to William Lebov's credit. The discipline interacted with the philological, historical, structuralist, neo-grammarian, and the generative traditions and schools, and grew as a reaction to dissatisfaction and the paradoxes contributed by these traditions. What emerged out of these is the social science of language. Here, I have put together a list of various contributions and more of social linguistics. The field has come a long way and has been expanding in terms of advances in technology, methodology, newer locations beyond the West, newer variables, newer challenges, newer questions, newer discoveries, and so on. And the list goes on and on. I'll give you, in a nutshell, some of the contributions with a focus on the West. I'll give you a second to read some of these. Okay. So we begin by talking about technology and methodology. I have to get rid of this window. Yes. There are admit. Okay. I'm sorry for the small interruptions because I'm the host, so I have to let people in. All right. So we talk about the role of technology in the development of the field and research, and I think that played a very important role. So two key technological innovations during the late 19th and the early 20th century, which were used extensively during the World War II, also paved the way for the developments of several fields of study and industry. One was the tape recorder, which made sound recording and reproduction possible, and which led to radio and film industry production. For our purposes, it made possible to record and replay speech, which brought objectivity to transcription. Then came various statistical and acoustic analysis software for personal computers and laptops, which revolutionized the field. Various transcription technologies, especially ELAN and speech-to-text technologies, were a great step forward in handling large amount of recorded data. ELAN facilitated multi-tier transcription and allowed speech to be synced with transcription. Then, of course, came graphics, etc., which added power to numerical results. Without these, the Atlas of North American English, which was produced in 2006, couldn't have been completed in a record time of 5 years, and the analysis of 100 years of change couldn't have been possible. One of the cornerstones of social linguistics is its methodology, a methodology for studying speech communities, random or careful sampling, ability to record large amounts of good quality conversational and other data from people. A central point of the methodology is how do people talk when they are not being observed? Interestingly, Leboff attributes part of it to a paper that Vogelin and Zelig-Harris wrote way back in 1951 about two ways of recording data. One is asking the informant, and the other one is recording the speaker. I quote, "They thought that this new invention called the tape recorder would make it possible to put emphasis on what people actually said, which is superior to on-the-spot transcription that dialect geographers and most linguists did at that time, despite the availability of tape recorders." Quotes off. It was first used in Martha's Vineyard and later in New York studies. This played an important role in the data and methodology, a first important benchmark which provided it an edge over other practices across linguistics and anthropology. In their recent book by Leboff and Gillensenkov, titled Conversation with Strangers, they recall their interviews with speakers over the years, which provided the scaffolding over which social linguistics was built. It has generated a large corpus of spoken English. Today, there are numerous similar archives that now exist across the globe, including India. I read, "This element documents the evolution of a research program that began in the early 60s with the author's first investigation of language change on Martha's Vineyard. It traces the development of what has become the basic framework for studying language variation and change. Interviews with strangers are the backbone of this research. The 10 American English speakers appearing here were all strangers to the interviewers at that time. They were selected as among the most memorable from thousands of interviews across 6 decades. The speakers expressed their ideas and concerns in the language of everyday life, dealing with their ways of earning a living, getting along with neighbors, raising a family, all matters in which their language serves them well. These people speak for themselves, and you will hear their voices. What they have to say is a monument to the richness and variety of American vernacular, offering a tour of studies that have built the field of social linguistics." The methodology had a positive impact on other fields of inquiry in linguistics. Over the past 20 years, questions have been raised on the adequacy of data in generative grammar. To quote from Featherstone, "We advanced 2 groups of reasons for syntacticians to do this, negative and positive. The negative stick group concerns the inadequacy of current practice. We argue that linguists are producing unsatisfactory work with these methods. Data quality is a limiting factor. A theory can only be as good as its database. The positive caret group concerns the descriptive and theoretical advantages which become available with more empirically adequate data." It's a whole workshop that was conducted, and anyone who is interested by Googling Featherstone can find the other papers. It keeps moving back. All right. The methodology that Leboff developed had to be learned through practice and having prior thorough understanding of the, I'm sorry, can't see it. Right. There are too many, admit. Fine. The methodology that Leboff developed had to be learned through practice and having prior thorough understanding of the city and the neighborhoods. He drew upon anthropological approaches to architecture to understand places available to observe interaction, and the interface of public and private spaces to understand how to approach people, what interests people, how to mitigate the effects of the observer's presence, and so on. A 1-year course, 560, was designed at Penn, where students went into the local neighborhoods and learned how to interview complete strangers, bring back recordings, transcribe and analyze the interviews, extract the narratives, and finally extract variables and so on. It is important to note that it's not an easy methodology where you hold a recorder and mic and ask a person to tell you a story. This grew into a corpus that was built over more than 40 years. This was combined with other ways of observing on and off recorder, participant observations, a variety of reading tasks, and various subjective reaction tasks and other experiments designed to test specific research questions as well as explore listeners' attitudes, judgments, and evaluation. This approach is totally different from the approaches used in other disciplines, subdisciplines of linguistics, including elicitation methods used in various documentation projects. Some social linguists too have begun to use such methods, especially those who study communities other than their own, and particularly for documentation purposes. But this leaves a huge gap behind in the understanding of the language, as there are communities other than their, as there is no way of cross-checking independently. Triangulation is the key in any methodology. Having said this can be coupled with data from talk shows on radio, television, written corpora, as well as historical materials. Casualness of speech styles, and social meaning. We can see the application of this approach to identify ways in which casualness of speech can be differentiated in speech, obtained through the interviews using the idea of social linguistic monitor. That is the attention paid to the speech. It may very well be attention paid to audience as well. For example, Alan Bell talked about audience, but that model somehow did not pick up. There's a lot of commonality between these two models, whether it is attention paid to the speech or to the audience, they work the same way. Starting from the responses to direct questions, to greater involvement, to focus shifting tangentially away from the topics raised, personal narratives, one finds differences in the casualness of speech. Now, why this was important? Because unless you can't figure out what casualness of speech is, unless you know what careful speech sounds like or looks like. So this provided a very important heuristic device on how to deal with the recorded speech. Everything that you got, and it might have, even if it sounds friendly, you cannot assume that this is how people actually talk. Few more people have joined. Admit. Okay. The same can be applied to differentiate among a variety of reading tasks, which yield different kinds of speech data in terms of attention paid to speech, as you have shown here. So from the minimal pairs to reading words to sentences to passages, we find similar styles can be evoked. Lebov, based on his studies of English in New York City, pioneered the idea of style shift. He identified a scale ranging from casual to formal speech styles. In this model, the interlocutors remain the same. The shifts in speech, therefore, coincide with the changing relationship between the two, the degree of comfort, familiarity between the two, especially on the part of addressees, assuming that the interviewer is a skilled interviewer, and consequent reduce attention paid to the speech. In order to understand casualness of speech, one should be able to identify instances of careful speech as well. Lebov was able to show how style plays an important role affecting how we speak. The linguistic choices available can be identified in terms of standardness or casualness of speech, and constraints that condition selection of linguistic choices may be conditioned by different kinds of constraints, including style, among others. Now I turn to classic studies and key findings. It was the 1916 study on contraction, deletion, and inherent variability of copula in Black English vernacular, which appeared in Language, that for the first time most convincingly demonstrated the idea of a variable grammar, and that variation is structured. The use of statistical computation in the study also paved the way for the development of the VOB rule program, which made logistic regression available to people. Presence or absence of Black English copula is not optional. The examples include she is good, she's good, and she good. The last one where you see copula is not there. There are contexts where copula is always or overwhelmingly present, and contexts where it is frequently missing. There is a copula in BEV at the underlying representation. There are several linguistic constraints at work that provide an analysis of this surface variability. A combination of several grammatical and phonological constraints together account for the observed variability. The study included several age groups, from pre-adolescents to adults, and a white adult group for comparison. The findings suggest that the pre-adolescents hadn't acquired all the constraints, or they haven't acquired all the constraints as yet. So language learning is not complete as we think by years, by 4 or 5 years of age. 2, Black English vernacular compares well with White English. 3, wherever White English can delete, Black English can contract. Wherever White English can contract, Black English can delete, for which a simple explanation exists: intolerance for CC clusters in specific context in Black English, among other factors. BEV is a well-structured system of grammar and not a half-broken English lacking logic. The study also found greater contraction and deletion in group interviews than solo interviews, providing validation of the utility of style and the casualness of speech. The study responded well and provided statistical evidence for various possible solutions, including rule ordering of contraction and deletion, as well as ordering of constraints that operate on contraction and deletion. The study paved the way for a software package, VOB rule, which made logistic regression possible on PCs and laptops. And since then, many more sophisticated statistical programs have come up. Admit, right. So this is a cross-tabulation of, just to give you an idea of the kind of research that was done and the kind of statistics that was utilized in this very first study. So this table, what you are seeing here, is a cross-tabulation of 2 sets of constraints, phonological and grammatical, that tells you that the 2 are independent of each other. For instance, the effect of pronominal subject, if you look here. So it tells you the effect of the pronominal subject is independent of the effects of a preceding vowel or a consonant. And the short forms abbreviations here refer to the predicate nominals, predicate locatives, verbs, and periphrastic future. Okay, we stop here and then we log out and we log in again using the next link. All right. Okay. So this is where we were last, where I talked about, we are talking about the very first study which made use of quantitative analysis. I mean, kind of logistic regression, way back in 1969. And that is the one that paved the way for the development of VOB rule analysis. And then there was no stopping. So this is the figure, this table that you see. It actually talks about a cross-tabulation of 2 sets of constraints, phonological and grammatical simultaneously. And that helps you figure out whether the two are independent of each other or whether there is an interaction. So for example, one would have probably thought of that the effect of pronominals is contributed by the fact that they end in vowels, but that is not what it is. It shows that the effect of the pronominal is independent of the preceding vowels and consonants. The study also ranked various constraints, but we'll skip this one. Okay. Other key developments. The various studies on New York City showed evidence for stylistic and social stratification of R and other variables. The research demonstrated the social meaning or the indexical value of the variables. It also demonstrated difference between what people think they do and what they actually do, using listeners' judgments. Major work on vowels paved the way for a theory of language change in progress. Principles of vowel shifting, splits and mergers, miscomprehensions and misperceptions arising out of dialect differences. Work on various non-vocalic variables contributed to the absence of change, stability, or stable variation. A comparison of vowel shifts across North America provided an understanding of the forces of transmission and diffusion. Several studies comparing children and parents, various generations of migrant families paved an understanding of what is to be learned. This is an overview which I'm giving, though I understand that many of you might be familiar with this, but there is also a possibility that some of you may not be familiar with this. Before launching on to a big survey of the New York City, Lebov carried out an anonymous survey of 3 departmental stores in the city for testing his hypothesis. This he did after duly studying their clientele, their location, structure of the stores, their pricing, policy towards advertising, display of merchandise, etc., to calculate their social status of the stores. The results proved Lebov's hypothesis about the social stratification of R. In subsequent studies, he constructed a socioeconomic index to calculate socioeconomic index. As you could see here, the pilot study of departmental stores, as well as the comprehensive studies of New York City that followed, suggested that the speech of the New York City is virtually artless. I can show you laser pointer, right? So if you look at this side in casual speech, right? And it shows up only in more careful context as you go from casual to the more careful, right? In casual speech, use of R is attested more in the speech of members of only the upper class. Older members of the second highest overgroup overdo R in the most careful speech, going beyond the highest socioeconomic group, that is the upper class, 9. The class and the style effect provided social meaning that speakers attach to the use of R. However, prestige alone is not sufficient to move people away from vernacular. That is the lesson from here. It showed that one's membership in a social class and style were the strongest determinants for the R presence, in addition to other phonological constraints. The study also probed how and when R was introduced into the city by the incoming wealthy merchants from other R-ful areas, which provided an explanation for why R has a class effect. It's a context-induced change from above. Another evidence of class behavior and style as attention paid to speech was shown in the use of the variables such as th as in think and dh as in this, which are pronounced variably with a stop and a fricative or an affricate pronunciation. Some of you may know this, but from the kind of in books that we know available on linguistics, say phonetics, we generally are shown that these variables have only one single pronunciation, which is the fricative pronunciation, but that is not the reality. They have as many as 3 different pronunciations. So as you could see here, so we are talking about these 3. In this case, an opposite behavior of R was shown, whereby the stop pronunciations were suppressed in more careful speech here, suggesting negative meaning attached to the stop pronunciation. A number of further studies across Western locations showed either social class or one of its constituents, such as occupation or educational levels, to be significant social correlates for many stable variables. Stable variable means where there is no change involved. There is a difference between what you think you do and what you actually do. Lebov and many others conducted several match guys tasks. The findings reveal a tendency to over-report the use of R and such forms, despite it did not form part of their everyday speech practice or behavior. There were also gender-based differences where women over-reported the use of R. This brought in a new dimension to the research. Why do people over or under-report? Or why is their reported behavior at odds with their actual behavior? It is not as simple as willful lying. Instead, such behavior stems unconsciously from the perceived social meaning or prestige associated with the variables. And people hear themselves using it and align themselves with it. No conscious deceit is involved. Instead, most of the respondents seem to perceive their own speech in terms of the norms at which they were aiming at rather than the one they produced. Likewise, there are several instances where people are not aware of the forms that they use, positive anymore, and many other examples are there. Effect of the prescriptive norms on the syntactic alternations. And we talk about here 2 constructions, particle up movement and complementizer that deletion. Later, Anthony Kroc and Kathy Small examined the role of standard or prescriptive norms on 2 syntactic alternations, namely particle movement and complementizer that deletion, as shown here in the examples. They utilized several hours of talk show conversation from a Philadelphia all-talk FM radio station. They compared the speech of the callers and the show hosts and their studio guests. The particle movement is known to be constrained by several factors such as semantic dependence of the particle on the verb, stress, and the length of the direct object NP, or the distance between the verb and the particle. Complementizer deletion is known to be affected by verb frequency, among other factors. What this study actually shows is that conscious prestige norms can have a powerful influence on speech. So the study showed greater use of particle movement and complementizer deletion in the speech of callers than the show host and the guest, as expected, given the differences in their social status. This difference does not disappear even after all the linguistic constraints are taken care of, suggesting the influence of prescriptive norms. They also tested the grammaticality judgment for the same constructions using undergraduate students. The construction without particle movement and with complementizers that were judged as more correct by these students. Based on years of research, several principles of language change appear. 1, presence of linguistic variation is a prerequisite for a change to happen. However, presence of variation does not guarantee that change will necessarily happen. Alternations can continue to coexist without replacing each other. Most changes operate at the subconscious level, because of which such changes are able to progress fast. Such changes are internally motivated and perhaps account for the bulk of the changes. Such changes are more often led by women than men. Changes pass through various phases such as actuation, propagation, and completion. A lot of things can happen in between too. By mapping the transmission of the change in apparent time, one can locate the leaders and the laggers. Such changes often originate in one of the intermediate social groups, not the highest and not the lowest. In the case of stable variation, speakers may have greater awareness of the forms and their social meaning, resulting in stylistic and social variation, as we just saw in the case of R and also TH and DH. Presence of age gradation, however, alone is not sufficient an indicator of a change. It is a change only if we find both the individual and the community change together. In addition to apparent time, there are also other indicators available of a change in progress. One such indicator is the presence of a curvilinear pattern showing origin of the change in centrally embedded groups in a socioeconomic hierarchy. But if you don't have a socioeconomic hierarchy, you will have other groups available. But Western social linguistics did not talk about anything beyond the socioeconomic hierarchy because that was the one which was very characteristic of their societies. Next, an independent confirmation of change can be obtained by combining real-time data when available with apparent time data or by revisiting the study after a lapse of time, either following a trend or a panel study. And we find several instances of each of those. As a demonstration, I bring an example from English in a non-Western context spoken in Guyana, but which replicates the same principles. This is my own study. This is only to avoid talking about vowels, which we find hard to relate with. So here you find, so the variable that is examined here is does from an early modern English and its multiple phonological variants, which are realized as does, Z, us, and is, and which I have abbreviated here as D, Z, E, and I, right? And there are other variants too, which are not discussed here. So this does functions as a pre-verbal habitual auxiliary and is presumably derived from the periphrastic do, the use of which in non-emphatic context is well documented in the history of early modern English. So instead of saying I do believe, if you simply say I believe in God, it means I always or I usually believe in God. Okay. And this variation is much more structural than stylistic or social in any direct sense. Okay. So what you see here in this table is the overall distribution of does and its variants. But this is not very instructive. If you look at its distribution across the speech community, you will find that not everyone uses all the variants. So we find as many as 4 different patterns attested. There are people who use does alone. There are people who use other variants as well, but to different degrees. So you have a group. So, right. But if this distribution is real, then we must find some kind of a social correlate of this. And that is what we actually find, which is age. So before we write here. So here you could see the change in progress. And before I talk about this, I should tell you that this phonological reduction that we see is the outcome of a number of processes, such as de-deletion, vowel contraction, vowel alternation. But it's not an outcome of progressive phonological weakening. Each of the processes is variably conditioned by a host of factors such as subject type, properties of preceding consonants, quality of preceding vowels, verbal categories, clause types, and grammatical category. And the onset of this change is correlated with another change that affected the pronouns, which I've discussed elsewhere. So what you see here, why do I call it a change in progress? What you see at the bottom is various age groups. It's a well age graded some data ranging from as young as 4-year-olds to people like 90 years old for people to admit. Okay. All right. So you could see that the use of does has been declining with the younger speakers. So it's not one change, it's a series of multiple changes, actually 3 changes. And on the other hand, the use of Z has been on the rise, taking over the older form. And along with that, a new form of is, though I've combined is and is emerging here. And you could see here, you can find easily the leaders here of this field, right? For the next change, it is this group that we can see. Okay, 1 second, please. Something has happened. All right. Right. And if you look at this table, it will tell you that the youngest age group here, they haven't acquired the is variant as yet. They do participate in the other change, which is the incremental use of Z. This is a usual table which is available, which is cited as a summary of the principles of language change, but I'm not showing all of it. I focused here only on those changes which originate from below. Okay. 440. Another important contribution comes from the study of diffusion of innovations in space in North America through mobility and contact. Using data from the Atlas of North American English, Leboeuf identifies 2 different mechanisms: transmission, which is the normal mode, and diffusion, where adults move with one system to the new town, and their children who happen to have parents from out of state have to negotiate a dialect contact situation. Transmission is as a term is more appropriate to use within a speech community. It refers to the unbroken chain of transmission across generations. So transmission produces continuities and diffusion alters grammars, right? So transmission refers to the unbroken chain of transmissions across generations, though of course not without change, under normal conditions. Diffusion refers to the spread of innovations from one speech community to another. In diffusion, the structural constraints may themselves get modified as patterns travel from one area to the next. These differences between the 2 processes seem to suggest that adults play an important role in learning of such patterns through contact and diffusion of such patterns to the rest of the population. The majority of the contact situations happen to be adult contact situations, but children-to-children contact also occurs. But before I go on to the more people joining here, admit. How do I get rid of this? Okay. So to illustrate this, and before I go to the examples from North America, I first draw upon an example of diffusion of un in Persian from Tehran to Ghazvin, which are located at a distance of barely 150 kilometers. So the variable here, raising of un, refers to actually raising of R to O and from O to U before nasals, as evident in the shift of the name of the capital city from Tehran to Tehran to Tehran. Here, you could see that. Okay. So the figure on the top shows increase in raising among younger speakers in both Tehran and Ghazvin here, and showing similar stylistic stratification. See, the lines are going very, very parallel to each other. In Tehran, the use of raised vowel shows decline, in use with increase in the levels of, sorry, not this one, yeah, here. And if you look at the bottom table here, it shows interesting differences. You can see that these lines are actually diverging from each other. So in Tehran, the use of race variance showed decline with use in the level of education here, right? Going from right to left. And in Gazvin, it is the opposite. Higher the level of education, greater is the use of race variant. And why should this be so? Between two places that are located just as a distance of 150 kilometers? Well, the answers lie in the history of the contact. So Gazvin, while it's a small town, the use of the race variant in Gazvin was absent at an earlier point in time. It was introduced by those traveling from Gazvin to Tehran for higher education. So it was introduced by those who had a college education in Tehran and then returned to Gazvin. As a result, in Gazvin, it came to be associated with education. So this was one example of what diffusion may do. It may have several outcomes. Okay. Now we turn to more examples where we actually see that the process of diffusion actually affects the grammar. It alters many constraints. So now we look at diffusion of New York City short R system from 1896 until later. So this study shows the outcome of a change that originated in the New York City and has now spread to 4 different areas. The change is actually attested across American cities. Almost all North American dialects show a raising and fronting of some members of the historical short R class. Short R, just for the sake of information, short R is a trap vowel which alternates between the earlier bath and bath, and the vowel is further raising and rising. We find many with diphthongs and raised onsets, as in dance, even dance, right? There are other examples I've listed here: can't, have, bath, etc. I generally avoid bringing vowel examples because we find it hard to relate with these changes in the vowels. But that's why I've added a lot of information here to make sure that everyone understands. There are also other terms here, like on glide, off glide, and in glide, which I might be using. So there are 5 types of systems that govern this tensing and raising across North America. One is the nasal system. All short R before nasal consonants are tense, as in man, manage, span, Spanish, etc., while all others are legs. The second system that produces short R in some parts of North America is raised, is all words with historical short R tense. This is found only in the inland north. A third one is continuous short R raising, where short R words are variably tensed with vowels before nasal codas leading and vowels before voiceless stops, and words with obstruents liquid onsets, as in glass and brag, remaining in low front position. There's another system called southern breaking, whereby breaking of a short R into low front nucleus, palatal glide, and following glide in the southern dialect areas. Then there is a complex short R system in New York City and mid-Atlantic states, where it is evident. It's a distribution of tense and lax vowels, which is governed by a complex of phonological, grammatical, stylistic, and lexical conditions. So these are the 5 systems. There is a warning that it will... Oh. Right. Okay. Now what you see here is, so this is the New York system that I just mentioned at the end. So the syllables which are close by nasals, voiceless fricatives, voice stops in the box, conditions tensing of short R in the New York City, and not all of these constraints were present earlier. The constraints Not all of these constraints were present earlier. The constraints has expanded over time to include more codas, like different nasals and different voiced plosives. Then there are additional constraints like the ones listed here, whereby tensing occurs in function words, open syllables, syllables closed by inflectional boundaries, initial short arc, abbreviation, in words learned late in life like alas, carafe, and there are a few lexical exceptions. Now, this slide, you could see a clear separation of the two phonetic classes here by the dark triangles showing the tensed vowels, which are an outcome of the application of the constraints. And you can see at the bottom the lax vowels. So this is the result of the formant analysis. F2 versus F1 have been actually plotted. But you also see clearly, so here, what you find here is a separation of tensed and the lax vowels. That's the evidence of this. But you also find violations if you look at the bottom one. So the darker triangles where you would expect rectangles are the violations here, right? Okay, so this New York City short R distribution has been repeatedly fairly stable throughout the 20th century, and it follows the same pattern throughout the area. So the question is, what happens to this complex structure when it diffuses to other communities? A general finding is that influence of the New York City with all structural complexity is found only in New York City and communities that have a history of direct contact with NYC. A number of lexical and phonetic details may or may not be copied along with the basic phonetic pattern, and most are subject to loss. Here now you see the diffusion of the New York City pattern to the neighboring area, which is the North Plains field of New Jersey. Here, if you see again violations, if you find rectangles among the triangles like this one, or the triangles among the rectangles, you can see the violations of this, which shows what has happened, right? So here tensing is expected, but you have a violation here, and here laxing is expected, and you have considerable several violations here. That's what this figure is all about. So overall, the Northern New Jersey short R system generally conforms to the description of the New York City short R system, but there are various violations that you could see. And two of the major violations are, one is the loss of the function constraint, as a result of which can and can't sound the same. In the area between the Hackensack and Passaic rivers, including Rutherford, there is a striking tendency to lose the functional constraints before nasal, so that can, M, N, and R sound as tense. Another loss is the open syllable constraint, which has become variable. So from being categorical, it has become variable. So it produces variable tensing in open syllable word types like planet or fashionable. On this slide, you see the diffusion of the New York City pattern to Albany. And again, we see here that the Albany shows the loss of open syllable constraint, and the auxiliary constraint is also severely affected. In fact, it's almost gone. So what remains is the separation of the tokens into a bimodal distribution of allophones, determined by the unusual phonetic constraints that are found in New York City, that is, voice stops and voiceless fricatives along with front nasals are tense. In Cincinnati, too, we find similar deviations. The open syllable constraint is consistently violated, as in Catholic, passive, fascinated, Davenport, Canada, shown as dark squares among the light triangles, top half of the figure, right? In addition, we find loss of function word grammatical constraints. And among the lex tokens, the only clear exception to the New York City patterns are vowels before a Wheeler stop. With respect to short R, in Orleans, there are significant similarities with the New York City pattern, as expected, given its history of close and frequent contacts with New York City. Despite it shows a very different picture, it aligns more with the southern states. However, there is a weakening of open syllable constraint here as well. So the resulting system seems to resemble that of the New York City phonetically, but there is a considerable loss of structural details. But we also find evidence of diffusion across ethno-linguistic groups. Since there are only 3 minutes left, I suggest we stop here and then we log in again. Is that okay? Instead of abruptly stopping?
Okay, ma'am. It's okay.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'll do it. Yes. Okay, is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am, we can see.
Okay. So I go back to the last, right. So far I talked about diffusion of of innovations in space. So what happens when an innovation or a form moves from one place to the other place? And one of the major finding here is that in the process of diffusion from one place to the next, or from one speech community to the next, there is a considerable loss of structural details. So the grammar gets altered. Okay. And similar processes can also be seen within the city of Philadelphia across ethno-linguistic groups. So this table that you can see here is again the tensing of short R, same variable, which is now shown for the whites and the Afro-Americans from the city of Philadelphia. And this comparison is based on 2 different studies carried out by two different people. It's not that they were carried out together, one in 89, 196, but nevertheless. And it looks at the effect of the following segments and also before the intravocalic nasals. These are a number of other things. And as you could see here, that the 2 groups show differences in the constraints. The first constraint they share, but the second one, there is a difference here. African Americans do not follow it as much. They do much less raising in this context comparatively. There is also a small difference here, which we can ignore here. But if you look at here, the bottom one under the square, here you find that a big difference. So it suggests that the 2 populations do not follow all the constraints similarly. Lebov attributes such differences again to contact among the adults and lack of normal transmission through children. To quote him, this loss of structural detail in diffusion across ethno-linguistic groups echoes the patterns of geographic diffusion, where context is largely through adult speakers. To this, we can also add the social distance and the residential segregation that exists in Philadelphia neighborhoods, which probably prevents normal access to the required group. Okay. According to Lebov, an unbroken sequence of parent-to-child transmission is required to maintain complex patterns of phonetic, grammatical, and lexical specifications like the New York City short R pattern. If speakers from other dialect areas enter the community in large numbers, their children will dilute the uniformity of the original pattern. Even in mid-Atlantic dialects, where the pattern is quite stable, there are indications of such a weakening. There are a number of studies from India that we can add to this, and as you will see in the coming days. Okay, now we move on to the next finding, which is also the last point that I have to discuss, which is the target of learning. In a large number of studies that have been carried out, a striking observation that emerges is that children initially learn from the parents or caretakers and then learn to focus on the broader speech community, and thus moving away from the parents or caretakers. Contrary to the popular belief that the parental background and home dialects may influence local dialects, studies after studies show the uniformity among children with parents from various backgrounds in the way they aim at local norms. Learning is outbound, which helps children acquire the local community's pattern and focus on the innovators and innovations, which thus enabling changes to move forward. We take one example here from Kurzweil and Williams' study on Milton Town Koine. Now, this study is important because the Milton Town Koine didn't even exist before 70s, and it came up only after that. And in 20 years, its population had grown manifold. The town received its immigrants from many different areas of England, and only 3% came from the immediate subregions, which could be reached, let's say, in 15 minutes drive. Now, this is not unusual about Milton Keynes. There have been numerous studies, in fact, about the with the urbanization, the rise of the new urban towns. So this is the history everywhere with industrial revolution and otherwise people started moving out of the rural areas into the and settling down urban areas. So the places or the towns which did not exist, they sprang up and their populations multiplied by many, many folds. It's the story of Delhi, it's the story of your own city as well. And it would be interesting actually to study what happens as a result of which. So maximum research have been carried out in British cities, but also elsewhere, and also a few in India. Okay. So this study is interesting because it is based on a sample of 98 speakers and it very well balanced boys and girls at 3 age levels, at the age of 4, 8, and 12 years, and together with the caretakers of each. And the figure here is about the goat vowel. I'm sorry, most of these examples are on vowels, right, which we find hard to relate with our Englishes, but nevertheless, that's what we have. Okay, so this is about the goat vowel. It's raising as you go from right to left, okay? So in this figure, on goat vowels, the 4-year-olds are quite parallel to their caretakers here. Sorry, escape this one. Right, here you could see, right? That the 4-year-olds here and their caretakers are quite parallel to each other, while the 8-year and the 12-year-olds have shifted to the front nuclei and rounded lines. Clearly, the 8-year-olds no longer take their parents' vowel systems as the target for language learning. There's no reason for us to believe that they might have started differently. But we find that, so given the fact that we have here 4-year-olds and we find this difference, that suggests that people, as they grow, they move away from their patterns that they learn at home or from their caretakers, and they aim at somewhere else. Own age cohorts and older siblings. And here is an example of 2nd and 3rd generation New Yorkers in the raising of the variable 2 vowels again, the tense one A and also the back one O. As we know, there was massive migration from Europe in the US in the late 19th century. A large number of children acquired English as a result in households where the caretakers or the parents were native speakers of languages other than English. So it was a common it was a common conception that somehow the dialect of New York City was influenced by these languages. It's not unusual to come across such, just a minute. Okay, maybe some more people admit admit. Okay. In fact, this is also usually said about Delhi, that Delhi speech is influenced by Punjabis. But if you look at the history, so there are lots of common folk beliefs. So New York is no exception. So there was a common conception, rather misconception, that the dialect of the New York City is actually influenced by these languages that the migrants coming from various parts of Europe brought along with them. Now, this table actually shows two phonetic shifts, one involving the tensing and raising of short R, and the other raising of O from O to U, as in coffee, etc., in the speech of second and third generation New Yorkers. So you have younger men from upper middle class, Jewish community, and then you have older women, again, but this time from working class community. The results show that there are no significant differences between the second and third generations in the raising of O. This suggests that the target for language learning was the same for children whose parents were speakers of Yiddish and those whose parents were native speakers, let's say, of the New York City dialect. So this is what I mean. So this is contrary to the popular belief that the New York dialect has been affected by immigrants' languages. My next and the final example, as you see here, it's a stepwise regression of second formant of F2 in O in Philadelphia neighborhood with age, gender, social class, neighborhood, and ethnicity factors, right? Now, this table, which is here what you find is the results of the multiple regression of one of the new and vigorous changes affecting the Philadelphia speech community. There are 112 speakers, and several factors such as gender, age, upper working class status, residence in two of the oldest settled working class neighborhoods have significant effect on the progress of this change, as you could see here, right? The ones outside this box, these are all significant. However, but ethnic membership is not significant, the one in the box. Only German appears to be significant at the 0.5 level here. However, considering that the German settlement was the earliest, going back to 4 to 5 generations, this negative effect on fronting of R is unlikely to be the result of linguistic influence. In Philadelphia, one is more likely to find a non-English mother tongue among the second and third generations of Italian and Jewish immigrants. However, generation status is also not significant, which confirms the equivalence of second and third generations found, as we saw earlier in the New York City. These and similar several studies suggest that learning is outwardly oriented, whereby children early on move away from the parental patterns if that is not in conformity with the larger community's patterns. Children begin to pay more attention to other younger members of the community. So that's it from me today. Thank you very much. So if there are any questions or comments, I'll be happy to address them. I'm sorry, this talk sounds a little bit short than what I thought, but it was a very difficult task to provide a very concise overview of the key findings. So I limited myself to some of these instead of putting my hands into lots of things. Okay, any questions and comments?
I'm Annamalai. Do you hear me?
Yes, please, sir. Tell me.
Yeah. I have a couple of observations and then question. First, observations. You have narrowed the meaning of social linguistics to variation studies and also Western perspective to Lebow's perspective of Lebow's work. I mean, that's your choice, but we should realize that there are other aspects of social linguistics, and there are other perspectives in the West itself. I see the Lebow's contribution come about when the variation studies shift to urban centers. Earlier, it was dialect studies, which were across geographical regions, and variations gave isoglasses and things like that. And the another thing is the emphasis on the natural speech, the descriptive linguistics of American Indian languages was mainly focused on the so-called ideal native speaker to get the right forms of the language, whereas Lebov shifted it to natural speech of the people. So these two shifts, the urban studies and focus on natural speech are important contributions which Lebov made. Now, coming to my question, when the Lebovian model was applied to Indian situation, I think it took off a different direction. For example, the caste dialects. I mean, they are not Lebovian at all. I mean, they are just dialect studies across social groups. Not only that, they took the caste to be given and then study the linguistic features of that caste, not like Lebov, who tried to identify the social formation on the basis of the language speech, whereas it was in the reverse directions in Indian side. Do you have any reason why the Lebovian approach or methodology did not take root in India and it took a different direction? That's the question.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I addressed some of it in my these 5 talks. I have designed whatever I have to say over 5 talks, where the first one I talked about the philosophy and the foundation, and why I chose to talk about here Lebov here, number 1, which I did last week. And in the coming 3 talks, I intend to talk about the expansion of social linguistics beyond the West, and where I would be bringing research essentially from India and maybe some part of the Asia Pacific. I would rather preempt, I mean, if I would say that today, but there are several reasons. See, one of the major factors is that why I call it Western perspectives, because it is based on the Western experiences. When we talk about a study of speech community, we know that each speech community is different from the others. And that is what is crucial to the study of the speech community. So we can't take a model and apply it blindly by taking it all without interrogating its suitability for the speech community that we are studying. So that's the reason that the speech communities elsewhere throw up a variety of different local, social, cultural factors. Excuse me. Sorry about that. It's my dogs wanted to come in. Right. So that's where you have, and there are other factors which I would talk about, as to why West produced a certain kinds of findings. Many of the key findings and the framework is all right, but it is the local realities which make all the more difference. So as I would talk about in the coming talks, the Western model is very, very vertical, and it's embedded in a monocultural ideology. Whereas if you look at India, it's not, it's horizontal, and we have a multicultural ideology. And that applies to many other communities around the world. And it is that where we see some of the factors not working, and which also allows us to actually interrogate, question, and expand the theory. So that's basically the major reason. And the other thing that you mentioned, that there are other traditions as well. Oh, yes, there have been. There have been a lot of people basically in the British school who actually worked that. But the reason that we actually bring about Lebov is that he's taking a very clear departure, because he's not interested simply in description of language or in simply developing a sociology of language. Rather, his main concern has been to have a theory of language structure, which is also social simultaneously. It is rooted in the society and mind simultaneously. So here you have a theory coming up, a way of gathering data, a way of producing accountable results, and making many fundamental assumptions like the locus of linguistic knowledge that I talked about in my first talk, that it doesn't lie with the individual alone, but that pattern is located into the speech community. So if you have to look at the mainstream contributions that have come, that's the reason that you can't avoid talking about Lebov. Here, I've mainly drawn on today in Lebov studies.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, sure.
I'll just
Yeah,
finish. I mean, I agree with you.
Yeah, so he has. Right. Right. So he actually brings in, and anytime he writes a paper, he brings in studies from elsewhere. So even when I was discussing about transmission and diffusion, he had profusely quoted examples from his students and from his research associates, right? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I agree with you about the reality of difference in the situation in India and in the West, monoculture, multicultural, all that. But I would think that they would apply to the theoretical model, but not to the methodology as such. But my sense is that Lebow's methodology was not used in India as the social-linguistic studies of variation shows. The other related question is, Lebov extended the variation studies to language change. As far as I know, it never happened in India. The social linguist going into explanation of language change. Maybe I'm wrong, but yes, that's not the shift which social linguistics took in India.
Well, if you want, talking about the 60s and 70s, it certainly did not happen. But starting from the 90s and the last 20, 30 years, a large body of research on variation and change and studies, social studies of variation and change across India have actually emerged. So that's what our contribution to social linguistics in India and also across Asia Pacific. A lot of research has been actually now initiated. And over the past 20 years, we must say we have built impressive archives of various languages in India, which compare very well with any other part of the world. And I wonder whether any other place has as huge an archive covering so many languages as we have been able to build up. So yes, you are right. So I can refer you to some of my articles. One that appeared in Journal of Social Linguistics called Genealogy of Social Linguistics in India. And then other two which have appeared in various anthologies, one by, I think it is OUP, and the one in Journal of APLV, and things like that I can share with you. If you read that, that would answer a whole lot of your questions. So yes, and I discussed in my last talk as to why this couldn't happen. This happened because of the untimely demise of Prabodh Pandit. If that hadn't happened, the situation in India would have been very, very different. So it's not that research didn't start. Pandit did do much of he initiated groundbreaking research, and the sample that he used for his Gujarat study was larger than the Lebov studies, or compared as well. And that's where he actually demonstrated what is wrong with the Dalek surveys and how not to take caste as people have popularly taken. Caste is not supposed to be understood like that. Anyhow, I'm not going into that in details for now, but it's not true. A lot of work actually has happened in India. So ever since my coming back and joining DU, Delhi University, and even before that, Assam University, we have been working nonstop. And you could see many of my students here from whose work I've been quoting, and I would be quoting in the coming talks extensively.
Thank you.
Any other questions and comments?
Yes. Thank you, Ma, once again, giving us such a beautiful narration regarding that. And I have a few questions. Actually, I would try to, compile it together. And we are into the field of social linguistics for past 35 years, doing social linguistic research in India. So in your understanding, in a comparison study between India and even the Western world, how far the difference between the West and even our the Asian area regarding the language complexity, especially if we talk about speech community and language community, the speech community and the language community, because in the West, complexity may not be that great or that visible as the language complexity here in India. So we have even caste plays a role in defining people group. So what is your view on or your take on those differences?
Okay, thank you for this very nice question. See, first of all, West is no less diverse than what we actually think. In fact, the diversity has been growing, even though the modern European nations were based on the idea of one language, sameness of one language, one nation, one population, but they were very heterogeneous right from the beginning. That's one. Two, with the growing globalization and we just mentioned about the migration that happened from Europe, that has been happening into the United States from the very, very beginning. And who are the Americans? They also came from somewhere. They are actually the settlers who came from somewhere else. So there has been a huge history of mobility across the West, from being the settlers to the population that they already encountered and the new people who entered because their population size was very, very small. Now, and if you look at where are the world cities located, they are located essentially in the West, but also elsewhere in the global South, like Japan, China, and now India, and so on and so forth. So diversity is no less. In fact, in 2010, a project was initiated across Europe to study the impact of free meeting will end in 10 minutes, doesn't matter, to actually study the impact of this growing diversity across. So you could see, I could refer you to two studies by, what's her name? Forgetting. I think it is Jenny Cheshire et al. There were two studies which were focused on London and on Paris. And one of them showed that London is showing signs of a rise of a new multicultural English, where the features now from the Asian populations are percolating up into the local English. And another study recently by Devyani Sharma, who works on Indian diaspora, showed that how the educated English is emerging as the second acceptable norm of English, where many of the people of Asian descent, not just Indian descent, that to second generation and third generation are increasingly turning their attention towards this new norm, which is emerging, bypassing the so-called BBC English, right? So a lot of things are happening, one. And the cast that you said, yes, it is these factors which, so how do you study a speech community? The first step to study a speech community is try to understand how it is organized. How it is. So it may be clan-based, it may be caste-based, it may be other factors. In fact, we find very little evidence or utility of social class, because the way urbanization and the industrial revolution happened in India, it sort of messed up the very idea of social class, and we were probably never organized like that. And the misreading of caste by the British, and the attempt to export social class to Indian settings or elsewhere. A lot of sociologists have talked about it, that about caste and about social class, why they actually are messed up in India. They don't work the way we have expected them to work. So like this, and coming about the complexity, yes, linguistic density index is very high in India and Asia. But the moot point is that this density or linguistic diversity is very, very old. It has coexisted for thousands of years, unlike the West, which has a very, very short history. It only has a history of a few hundred years. If we talk about their history starting from the colonization of these places, right? So that makes an important difference, which has made us multicultural. In fact, rest of the world is multicultural, unlike the West, which is monocultural, and is monocultural more in its ideology than in reality. And it is that which has impacted is humanities and social sciences, and also its way of dominating knowledge, and its way of universalizing that knowledge and thinking there is one way of understanding the other. After all, the field of anthropology all began with the understanding of the other. And whereas they were looking at us, our history, our historical reconstruction from their own eyes. Hence the whole debate about a nation can accommodate only one population, one race. So only one is the natural resident, the other one must be invaders. Hence the Aryan and the non-Aryan divide, which many scholars and particularly Indian scholars don't agree with, right? So I will be taking up these issues in the coming talks. And if we do, if Zoom decides to cut us off, either we can log in back or we can meet next time. Did I address your concern?
Yes, ma'am. If you allow me, I have a second question. That will be
Please.
the end of my question session. Yes.
Sure.
Yeah. So, what is your comment on regarding the vitality of languages? Especially, I would like to hear some of the things regarding the minority languages, because the minority languages in India, more often than regarding the number of minority languages in India is than the numbers we found in the West. So, apart from the African thing. So, the vitality even depends on, if you take some of the examples here in the northeast part of India, we have tribes, small minority tribes with 500 to 700 people speaking a special dialect, their own way of speaking. So, and by the way, admitting the fact that we have linguistic diversity, even talking about the language families differentiation, because we have Indo-Aryan, we have even Tibeto-Burman languages, even the mix of it also called as Mon-Khmer languages also exists in some part. So, admitting the fact that even the multilingualism is also affecting very highly. But what is your observation regarding the phonetical differences when the degree of contact between languages makes? Is it often happens in West, or do you find more happens in India? Because I found it a little bit different than the other thing.
I think Zoom might just cut us off because this is a long answer, but a short answer to the short question. I wouldn't really go into these comparisons because that requires a comparison, number one, right? But I would say here that wherever you find density, linguistic density, you have to imagine and accept presence of numerous small scale communities. You can't have communities of equal numbers of people or speakers everywhere. And you also have to see the reasons why some communities are larger and some communities are smaller. You have to go into the history of the agriculture and see how agriculture, which could have surplus, that was responsible for the large populations or larger communities because they were settled. Majority of the communities which were involved in itinerary nomadic, they were moving, they couldn't have afforded to have a very large community because of the high mortality and also because of them breaking down and multiplying in terms of villages or settlements, etc., which in due course of time must have given rise to more heterogeneity. So we can't look at the present day situation and then compare it synchronically with the West and this whole agenda of language endangerment. You have to again see it. Read my paper, which is published this January in DLA, where there's a comment which talks about the equality of linguistic rights, social justice, and says that the official not having official recognition leads to which sort of disenfranchises the languages. But in a multilingual India, is it really possible to have every language to have the equal role to play in the official machinery? You can't have it. So if in this Zoom meeting of 50 people or 100 people, how do you communicate if you want me to speak in everyone's language? No industry, no system can work without a language policy. You have to have a mechanism to legislate such diversity. So the question is, how do you legislate such a diversity? And how has India managed to survive millenniums, right, with this kind of diversity without giving ever rise to linguistic conflicts? Why are we seeing these conflicts now, and which we never heard of earlier? And that too, we are seeing them because they are also to a large extent being orchestrated. So we are doing something what we shouldn't be doing for a multicultural space. There is no need to build one language, one identity, and then introduce scripts for every language and then standardize and thereby take away the diversity, the dialectal diversity that exists. So we are totally gone wrong. Here we are looking at with European eyes, the models, and trying to read India, which is where we have gone horribly, horribly, horribly wrong. And I hope we don't do that. Rather, it would be more interesting to see what's happening to languages. Why? I mean, it's normal for people to shift their practices, but it's more important to study how and what things happen. So that's why I chose the example that I did. I could have spoken for 2 hours, but that was of no use. So I deliberately chosen transmission and diffusion to show how the languages change with every act of mobility, right? And how children still, without any difficulty, regardless of what their parents speak, they aim at the local languages. That's how lingua francas emerge. Otherwise, Delhi, there would be riots, right? On language-based, we never heard any language-based riots or race-based riots before 1947. When did we hear that? We actually did not hear that. There is no history of that. Today, we are making those identities, creating them and making them saying these are the, but we have multiple language identities. We don't have a single identity. That's why the concept of native language, first language, second language are such a problem in a multicultural place, right? Time left 1 minute. One last question, please? Or comment, observation? I love your question, so ask me.
Just a comment. For example, people do not have a background of phonetics or phonology may find it very difficult to understand the examples, because when we teach phonetics here, we will try to avoid examples. For example, your cat may not be my cat. So that is a different, just one observation.
No, absolutely. That's why I had difficulty in picking up examples from the Western studies, and I avoided talking about examples from Western studies on language change. I picked up an example from my own study. So no matter what variables we take, when we take it from Asia, it's easier for us to relate ourselves with that. So I perfectly understand, because we don't speak like that. So it doesn't make sense to us, and we get lost in those symbols of what is raising from where to where, right? I perfectly empathize with you on that one. So, okay, thank you all.
Actually, this lecture is very informative and very useful to our Indian students. I thank you for that. Special thanks for
Some connectivity.
selecting such a topic. And it is very useful, and you have clearly,
So before we actually stop,
stated the
I
facts.
wanted to ask
And
the
so naturally,
audience.
based on this, I think we may have to have some rethinking. And now it is almost time, so I invite Dr. Gina S. Nair to propose a vote of thanks.
Good afternoon. Distinguished guest Professor Shobha, Satyanath ma'am, our Director Professor G.K. Padikar, and the participants both offline and online mode. On the behalf of ISDL, it's my privilege to propose vote of thanks on this occasion. First and foremost, I thank our special guest, Professor Shobha Satyanath, former Professor, Department of Linguistics, University of Delhi, for the very informative and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you, ma'am. For the topic Social Linguistics, the Western Perspective. I would like to thank our director, Professor G.K. Padikar, sir, for arranging this lecture series. Thank you, sir. And also thank all the participants in both online and offline mode for making the second day of the lecture series a successful one. Once again, and thank you, one and all.
Great audience. Thank you so much. Thank you, DLA, for giving me this opportunity. So I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
The next lecture series will be on 13th February, Tuesday, on 10:30. Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thank you, ma'am. God bless you.